An ancient word is taken from John chapter 2, 13 through 22. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a rip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Here ends the lesson.
An interesting story, an interesting passage, a passage that's present in all 4 of the gospel stories. It is interesting that when we read the story out of Mark, out of John, we're reading the story in the 2nd chapter, very close to the beginning of Jesus' ministry. But when we read the story out of Mark and Matthew and Luke, it's at the end of the ministry, during the last week of Jesus' life, part of the Passion story. It has a different purpose in the Gospels. In the story of John, he's pairing that with the wedding at Cana and illustrating to us a truth that speaks today as well as then. That when you see Jesus, he does miraculous things. And when you see Jesus, that's where you discover God. You don't discover God in the temple, in earthly treasures. You discover God in the living Christ. The living Christ. And we're bringing that forward today. You know that this is the 3rd week of Lent, and during Lent we have a series that we're studying together, starting off with our baptism, the image, the symbolism of baptism, claiming our faith, confirming our faith, living it out. And last week we were looking at our doing, considering the symbolism of the cross. Our doing is more than just doing good things. Our doing is representation of our image of what it means to be a Christian today. And today, of course, we're adding to that with the image of anticipating the risen Christ, the living Christ, and living the living Christ today as we build the church. So we have that symbol. Along with today, I'd like to add a second symbol, because I believe that today, to be the church that represents the living Christ, we need another concept to bring with us. And with that, I'd like to go back to Moses. To use Matthew's term, Moses was the first Moses, Jesus was the second Moses. But in Deuteronomy, Moses is looking back on the time that the Israelites spent in the desert about 39 years at that point. And he's reflecting with the people on their passage, and he's reflecting on the awesomeness of God and how God stood with them. Deuteronomy, or number 1, starting with verse 6. At Mount Horeb, most scholars believe Mount Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, the Lord our God told us, "You've been at this mountain long enough. Get going. Enter the hills of the Amorites and the surrounding areas in the deserts, the highlands, the Canaanite lowlands, the arid southern region, the seacoast, the Lebanon range, all the way to the great Euphrates River. Look, I have laid the land before you. Go and possess the land that I promised to give to your ancestors." The concept of not only living with the anticipation of the living Christ, but the call to move forward. In Moses' day, God led them out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea. They sat at the foot of Mount Sinai. They started to get a little comfortable. There was a group of people, of course, who questioned whether it made sense to even be here. They wanted to go back to Egypt. We see the story that they say, at least in Egypt, we had food, we had water. Maybe we were slaves, but what are we doing here? And then you had a group of people who were just content to stay at the foot of Mount Sinai. Things are better than they were back in Egypt. And they looked out over the horizon, and it was scary. Scary, the thought of moving forward. Who knows what dangers are out there. And in the midst of that confusion, God is calling them to move forward, to get off this mountain and claim the richness of the promised land. And today we continue to be called to get off our mountain of content and move forward into the living Christ. What mountains do we tend to get caught up in? The mountain of racial inequality. It's been 50 years since we crossed the bridge in Selma. And some of us can say, "Oh, my word, we've traveled so far. Things are so much better now than they were." And we can sit down and be content with the way things are. And God's calling us forward. No, you're not in the promised land yet. Continue to move forward. Don't ask questions about whether things are good enough. Read the newspaper. We have more work to do. Gender inequality. Most of us have moved forward with this, but again, we can get content. Things are good enough. My word, most denominations today are ordaining men and women alike. Most denominations today at their seminaries, it's 50-50 ratios between men and women. Look at what we've done. We need to get off that mountain and continue to move forward. And then the church fight with science. Oh, my word. We need to get off that mountain and move forward also. Statistics tell me that 40% of us either believe or think that they need to believe that the earth was created in less than 10,000 years. It's only 10,000 years old. We need to get off that mountain and speak the truth that we know. Any others, of course, the gay and lesbian issues, the mountain of conversation that we've been involved with. Moses led the Israelites through the desert for 40 years, and we think, oh my word, that was a long time. We've been debating the gay and lesbian issue for 50 years. We need to get off this mountain. Science, good science, has made it very, very clear. And if a politician today tells us that we need to re-look at that issue, we have every right in the world to turn the channel and to listen to someone else. The issue is settled. We need to move off those mountains. Why? For many reasons. It's the right thing to do, but if we consume our energy in those past issues, those past events, we don't have any energy, we don't have any focus to deal with the issues today. And that's not fair to the current generation. And if we don't have energy or time to deal with the issues today, then when we read the sign out front that says, "Is the church helpful?" probably the answer would be no. They're not dealing with the issues that I'm dealing with. They're asking these questions that have long since been answered. And then we come up with issued statements. What do you think of Christians today? When we ask people who aren't involved in the church, we often get, well, they're literalistic, they're anti-intellectual, they're self-righteous, judgmental, they're bigots. We can't afford to continue those images. We need to live with the living Christ. We need to move forward and deal with the issues that we're dealing with today. And what are those issues? I'm going to just focus on three. Three that I hear commonly. This starts the conversation, but I'm sure you can add 3, 4, 5 more. But I'm thinking of the issues of jobs, meaningful work, community, and the whole concept of God. Issues that we're dealing with today. There was an article in the Washington Post that talked about some research where they put together a series of questions and gave this to people all around the world, the questionnaire. And it was trying to measure a person's job readiness skills. And the interesting thing with this was that it was given to people from 18 to 65, 18 years old to 65. Instead of beating up one generation or another, let's go for the whole 9 yards. In the United States, we came in dead last. The researchers said we did abysmally on this test. Now, I haven't seen the test. I don't know if it's good or bad or indifferent. But for Pete's sake, in the church today, we need to do everything we can to help our kids, to help us be competitive in the world economy. We need to lean into wisdom. We need to take opportunities and point them out to the next generation and say, go for it. This is a great world that God created. Be a part of it. Be a part of the transformation, the transitions. Bad religion can affect a society. To illustrate this, let's go back 1,000 years. There was a time when the Arab world was the center of knowledge and wisdom in the entire world. During the Ottoman period, there was this golden age of research, of exploration. Today, if you look at a list of all the stars that have names, 2/3 of them have Arabic names because they were the first ones to look up at the heavens. And we didn't have telescopes, but we had the naked eye. And the brightest stars in the sky, 2/3 of them still have Arabic names. Doing math, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, those are Arabic numerals. They were much ahead of the rest of the world. And then around 1100, There was a theologian, Abu Ghazali, and he got angry with numbers. Manipulating numbers is of the devil. And he got angry with rationalism, and that permeated through the society. And within 100 years, intellectual thought diminished virtually to nothing. And their society has never really recovered from that. Bad religion can negatively influence the society around us. We owe it to our kids to have good religion. Community today. It's fascinating to me that we are so globally connected with one another and at the same time so socially isolated. What a paradox that we live in. How do we create community? Does the church have anything to say about that? Oh, yeah, we do. Let's spend some time with that, more time. And sometimes that can be our strength. We have all these wonderful comfort foods, potlucks and so forth, and we have, pot pie. Well, what if I don't like pot pie? It has those thick homemade noodles in it and potatoes and a little bit of chicken broth, but that's a little starchy for me. Well, just take a second bowl. It's what we do. But if I'm not part of that community, how do I become part of that community? Sometimes what we do best can limit our abilities to reach out. Our strengths can be our weaknesses. But today in our society, in our culture, we need community. Our understanding of God. Oh my. Just a little history. I love to tell history stories, but it's fascinating. As we look at the biblical stories more and more, throughout the biblical stories, we have differing opinions about the nature of Jesus, the nature of God and Jesus, how they relate to one another. The stories are still intermixed within the gospel accounts, within the letters of Paul. We have differing opinions. And for the first 300 years, that was part of our tradition, to have conversations, to have arguments with one another. And then around 300, Emperor Constantine, wanted to make Christianity the official religion of the empire. Why? Because he wanted to bring the empire together. He just won a civil war, so politically the empire is being united. Now he wanted to unite the empire around religion, and Christianity was chosen. But then he discovered one thing about us Christians: we argue a lot, we don't agree. So he calls together the Council of Nicaea. Basically tells the bishops, I don't really care what you decide, but decide. Decide what's real. And so we came up with doctrines, we came up with statements that decided the nature of Christ, the nature of the relationship between Christ and God, and so forth. And if you didn't sign on to that doctrine, you were booted out of the empire. The church that you were affiliated with was given to the neighbor who did sign the document. All but 2 or 3 of the bishops ended up signing off on that. But for the next 700 years, we lived within that concept of all needing to think the same. And then around 1054, we divided into 2 over questions of the nature of God and the relationship between God and Christ. We have the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox, which we still have today. And we lived with those 2 understandings, those 2 concepts where we all attempted to agree with either one or the other for another 500 years. And then the Roman Catholic Church divided between Protestantism and Roman Catholic Church. And oh my word, for the last 500 years, the Protestants have been going crazy. How many hundreds of denominations do we have? All trying to get us to believe the same within our group. And sometimes the groups get very, very small. It's interesting that the UCC went against that model and brought 4 denominations together. We can live together. Can we? I don't know. It's still an experiment. It's interesting to me that out of the 4 denominations that came together, there's dramatically different understandings of the image of God. We have some who have a concept of the living God, the living Christ, being very, very close, walking with me, carrying my burdens with me. St. Augustine in the 400s, our hearts are restless till they rest with thee. Oh, what a wonderful concept. Very short statement, but it captures that God will never leave us. God is by our side, holding us in the strength of God's arms during times of trial and tribulation. He's keeping our souls safe. That close relationship of God. That's one part of the UCC model. But then there's other denominations that were brought in who have a very big image of God, captured in a monk from the 700s. God is the spacelessness beyond all spaces, beyond left and right, beyond east and west. God is the timelessness beyond all time, beyond past and future, beyond months and years. Whatever we call God, God is not that. God is the fullness for which we yearn, the satisfaction that cannot be named. These 2 diametrically opposed images of God and Christ coming together in one denomination. It will be interesting to see what we do with that. But I love that model because today there seems to be less energy put into thinking the same thing. We seem to be going back to the original concept of what it means to be a follower of Christ. Let's work at this together. And what we believe, what we think is important, but that we're following the living Christ is what's really important. And how is our life being transformed? How is our life being changed? Those are some of the questions we're asking today. And will we be helpful with that? Or will we get in the way of that? I hope we're helpful. So during this time of Lent, yes, we're confirming our faith with our baptism. During this time of Lent, we're focusing on what we do, carrying our cross. What does that mean? And during this time of Lent, what about our thoughts? What about our attitudes? Are we stuck on a mountain that's the previous 20, 30 years old? Are we willing to get off that mountain and to move ahead as God challenged the Israelites? Are we willing, are we able to deal with the problems today? If we want to represent the living Christ, we need to deal with today's issues. Be the church. As we just sang, change my heart, O God, make it ever true. Change my heart, O God, may I be more like you.